50 American dive bombers came down on the Japanese carrier fleet at 22 minutes past 10 in the morning. 3 of the 4 carriers below them were finished. Japan never rebuilt the force that died there, and the men it could not replace were not the pilots. For 60 years, what Americans pictured on those flight decks came from one Japanese officer's memoir. Japan's own war records say it did not happen that way. He described decks packed with aircraft, engines running, bombs and torpedoes hanging, a strike moments from launching when the American bombs arrived. It has been painted, filmed, and reprinted so many times that it has become the picture almost everyone carries. When the Imperial Navy's official war history was finally published, it showed something else entirely, and it took decades for that to cross the Pacific. This is the 4th of June, 1942, reconstructed from the Japanese operational records. What the Americans did, in what order, and what the men on those flight decks were actually doing when the bombs came through. Those records sat untranslated while the legend hardened. If you want history built out of the documents, rather than out of the legend, hit like. 1 like, nothing more, and we carry on. By the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had won everything it set out to win, and had solved nothing. The perimeter it now held ran from the Aleutians to the Solomons, and from the Marshalls to the Bay of Bengal. On a map it looked like an empire. In practice it was a fence with no one standing along most of it. Japan did not have the ships, the aircraft, or the fuel to garrison that much ocean, and every mile of it was open to an enemy who could choose where and when to arrive. The Doolittle raid in April had made that point in public, and it settled an argument that had been running inside the Naval General Staff for months. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's answer was not to hold the fence. It was to destroy the thing that could come through it. He did not particularly want Midway Atoll, which was 2 square miles of sand and coral with an airstrip on it and no fresh water to speak of. He wanted the American aircraft carriers, and he believed that if he threatened Midway, the carriers would have to come out and fight for it. The reasoning was sound as far as it went. The execution required Yamamoto to sail most of the Imperial Japanese Navy several thousand miles from its bases, to the far end of its own supply lines, in order to attack a defended position held by a force he believed to be weaker but could not see. It is the oldest error in the book, and it has been made by commanders far less capable than Yamamoto, usually for the same reason. He had won every engagement he had fought so far, and he had begun to assume the enemy would keep behaving the way the enemy had behaved. The assumption was written into the operations order itself. The commander's estimate of the situation, the document that framed how the battle was expected to unfold, stated plainly that the enemy lacked the will to fight. That sentence is the whole battle in miniature. Everything the Japanese did over the following 6 weeks proceeded from it, and it was wrong on the morning it was written. The Americans were not guessing. In a windowless basement in the administration building at Pearl Harbor, a unit of cryptanalysts under Commander Joseph Rochefort had been working on the Imperial Navy's principal operational code since before the war started. They did not read it cleanly. Nobody in that basement ever saw a Japanese message the way you are reading this sentence. What they saw were fragments, recovered code groups, repeated addresses, patterns of traffic volume, and long gaps where the meaning simply did not come. Out of that, they built a picture. Through the spring of 1942, the traffic began to concentrate around an objective the Japanese identified by a 2-letter designator, AF. Rochefort's unit believed AF was Midway. Washington was not convinced, and the disagreement mattered enormously, because if AF was somewhere else, then Admiral Chester Nimitz would be moving his entire remaining carrier strength to the wrong piece of ocean. The way the argument was settled has become the most repeated story in the history of American signals intelligence, and it is repeated because it is genuinely elegant. Midway was instructed, over a cable the Japanese could not read, to broadcast in the clear that its water distillation plant had failed. Shortly afterward, Japanese traffic reported that AF was short of fresh water. That is the sort of thing that sounds like invention and was not. It gave Nimitz the location. Further work gave him the approximate date, the composition of the striking force, and the axis along which it would approach. What Nimitz did with that is the part that matters, and it is worth being precise about, because it is where the battle was actually decided. He was not handed a victory. He was handed a piece of information that would be worth nothing at all unless he acted on it faster than the enemy could change the plan it described. Intelligence has an expiry date, and Nimitz had perhaps 3 weeks. He spent them arranging to be in the right place, with more aircraft than the enemy expected him to have. That is not luck. That is a man reading a document correctly and then doing something difficult about it. The Japanese plan was called Operation MI, and its central weakness was visible on the chart before a single ship sailed. Yamamoto did not send one fleet to Midway. He sent 5 separate forces, spread across thousands of miles of the Pacific, each with its own commander, its own objective, and its own timetable. There was the carrier striking force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo with 4 fleet carriers. There was an invasion convoy carrying the troops meant to occupy the atoll. There was Yamamoto's own main body, built around the largest battleships in the world, positioned hundreds of miles behind the carriers where it could neither see the battle nor influence it. There was a separate operation running simultaneously in the Aleutians, far to the north, involving carriers and cruisers and troops that were not available anywhere else. The dispersal was deliberate. Japanese naval planning had long favored complex schemes involving multiple detachments, converging from multiple directions, on the theory that an enemy confronted with several threats at once would be unable to concentrate against any of them. It looks impressive drawn out on a plotting board. It requires a standard of communication and timing that radio silence, weather, and battle damage make impossible, and it guarantees that at the decisive moment, most of your strength will be 100 miles from the fighting. That is exactly what happened. When the fighting started on the morning of the 4th of June, none of the remainder of that enormous force was in a position to affect the outcome. The battleships never fired. The invasion convoy never landed. The Aleutians force fought its own small separate war 1,000 miles north, and had no bearing on anything. 4 Japanese carriers went into that battle. Everything else Japan brought to the Central Pacific that week was, in operational terms, decoration. Against those 4 carriers, Nimitz put 3, and an island. Tactical command at sea belonged to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher in Task Force 17, flying his flag in the Yorktown. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance had Task Force 16, with the Enterprise and the Hornet having taken it over at short notice when Vice Admiral William Halsey was hospitalized. Spruance had never commanded carriers. He was a cruiser officer, and he inherited Halsey's staff along with Halsey's ships, which turned out to matter. The Yorktown should not have been there at all. She had been badly damaged at the Coral Sea a month earlier, and the estimates for putting her right ran into months. She went into dry dock at Pearl Harbor and came out again in a matter of days, patched rather than repaired, with civilian yard workers still aboard as she sailed. Add Midway's own airstrip to the 2 task forces, and the arithmetic comes out as follows. Nagumo's 4 carriers embarked somewhat under 250 aircraft between them. The Americans had 360 available to throw at him, counting everything based on the atoll. The atoll could not be sunk. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the operative military fact of the entire battle. Nagumo had to neutralize an airfield that would still be there no matter how many bombs he put on it, while operating within range of it. while also finding and destroying a carrier force he did not know was waiting for him. Nimitz had arranged for his enemy to arrive at a specific patch of ocean on a specific morning, outnumbered in aircraft, and obliged to attack a target that could not be removed. He did that with a fragment of code, 3 weeks, and a shipyard working around the clock. The Japanese strike went off before dawn on the 4th of June, 108 aircraft, drawn from all 4 carriers, tasked with destroying Midway's defenses ahead of the landing. They found the atoll awake. American search aircraft had been flying wide patterns for days, and the incoming raid was picked up early enough that by the time it arrived, every serviceable aircraft on Midway was airborne and gone. There was nothing on the ground to destroy except installations, and installations on a coral atoll are cheap. The strike did its work. It cratered the runway, burned fuel storage, wrecked buildings, and killed men on the ground. Then it turned for home. A little after 5:30 in the morning, a patrol aircraft out of Midway reported 2 Japanese carriers and their escorts, with a bearing, a distance, and a course. The signal reached Fletcher in the Yorktown within minutes. Fletcher had a decision to make about a fleet he still could not see in full. The report gave him 2 carriers. Intelligence had told him to expect 4. Committing his strike against 2, while the other 2 were somewhere unaccounted for, was the kind of thing that had cost admirals their fleets in this ocean already. He did it anyway, in stages. He detached Spruance with Task Force 16 and ordered him to attack, while the Yorktown held back to recover her own morning search aircraft and keep something in hand against the 2 carriers still unaccounted for. Dividing a force is generally an error. Here it produced the single most valuable accident of the day, because when the Yorktown finally launched an hour behind Task Force 16, her aircraft reached the target at a different moment and on a different bearing from the Enterprise group. The next decision was Spruance's, and it came out of the staff he had inherited. Standard practice was to close the range before launching, because a strike sent off at extreme distance arrives with less fuel, less time over the target, and a marginal prospect of getting home. Halsey's chief of staff, Captain Miles Browning, argued for launching early and long anyway, on the reasoning that Japanese carriers caught in the middle of recovering their Midway strike would be worth far more than Japanese carriers caught comfortably. Spruance had commanded carriers for 4 days. He took the advice and sent his aircraft off at a range that put them near the limit of their endurance. The judgment was correct. A number of his pilots paid for it by coming down in the water on the way home. At about the hour Task Force 16 began putting aircraft into the air, the officer leading the Japanese strike back from Midway sent Nagumo a signal that would shape everything after it. A second attack on the atoll was necessary. The assessment was accurate. It was also the beginning of Nagumo's problem, because the aircraft still aboard his carriers were armed for a different mission entirely. Japanese practice held roughly half the air group in reserve against the appearance of enemy warships. Those aircraft were configured for ships, torpedoes on the attack bombers, armor-piercing bombs on the dive bombers. Ordnance suited to sinking a carrier is not ordnance suited to cratering a runway, and converting from one to the other is not a matter of minutes. So Nagumo had to decide whether to strip his reserve and rearm it for the island while holding a defensive posture against an enemy fleet his own reconnaissance had not found. While the American strike was forming up, Nagumo was still looking for the ships it had come from. Why he could not find them is a matter of how the Imperial Japanese Navy searched the sea. The Imperial Navy treated reconnaissance as a secondary function. The strike aircraft were the point of a carrier. Searching was work for cruiser float planes and for whatever could be spared. A search pattern flown by a small number of single-engine aircraft, each sweeping outward along a single leg and then returning, covers an area shaped like a fan with enormous empty spaces between the spokes. The further out you go, the wider the gaps become. A fleet sitting in one of those gaps is invisible, and it stays invisible for as long as it stays there. The Americans had built their scouting differently. Carrier scouting squadrons flew search missions as a primary task, in numbers, and the atoll itself launched long-range patrol aircraft that swept hundreds of miles in every direction every day. Midway's search aircraft found the Japanese carriers on the morning of the 4th of June. Nagumo's search aircraft did not find the Americans until the battle was already underway. When the report finally came in, it came from a float plane off the cruiser Tone, and it came in badly. The first message reported ships. It did not say what kind. Nagumo asked for clarification and waited. The follow-up, when it came, mentioned a carrier. So he now knew there was an American carrier within striking distance, somewhere on a bearing he could not fix precisely, belonging to a force he had been assured would not come out. While Nagumo was waiting to hear what his scout had actually found, the attacks began, and for the next 2 hours they did not stop. The Americans threw everything within reach at the Japanese carriers in wave after separate wave, and none of it worked. Midway's own aircraft went first. Marine dive bombers flying obsolete machines, Army heavy bombers releasing from altitude, torpedo bombers going in at wave height without escort. They achieved nothing. Not one bomb, not one torpedo found a Japanese ship. The heavy bombers, dropping from 20,000 feet at ships making 30 knots, were never going to hit anything, and the men who flew the low attacks were shot to pieces by a fighter screen they had no answer to. Then the carrier torpedo squadrons arrived, and what happened to them has been argued about ever since. They came in without fighter escort, in obsolete devastators that were slow enough that Japanese pilots described attacking them as a straightforward matter. The Devastator had been a modern aircraft in 1937. By 1942, it was slower than the fighters defending the target. It carried a torpedo that had to be dropped low, level, and straight to have any chance of running properly, and its crews knew all of this. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet found the Japanese fleet by flying a course its commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had chosen against the one his air group had been given. He was right about where the enemy was. He arrived with 15 aircraft, no escort, and no other American squadron in sight, and he attacked. The squadron was destroyed. One man came out of the water alive. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise pursued the Kaga and lost all but 5 of its 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown attacked the Soryu, and of that squadron only 5 aircraft got close enough to release. Every torpedo missed. Across 3 squadrons and more than 40 aircraft, the Americans put nothing into a Japanese hull. For 2 generations, American accounts explained this with a consoling logic. The torpedo squadrons had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, clearing the sky above for the dive bombers that arrived shortly afterward. Their deaths had bought the victory. The Japanese records do not support that. What pulled the fighter cover out of position was the fighter cover itself. Japanese pilot discipline in the air over the carriers was poor. Individual sections chased targets rather than holding assigned altitudes, and the Kido Butai's system for controlling its own combat air patrol was inadequate to the job of managing a defense at multiple levels simultaneously. The torpedo squadrons did not pull the Zeros down. The Zeros went down because that was how they were being flown. This does not diminish the men who flew those aircraft. It changes what their courage was for. They took off knowing the odds. They flew into a defended fleet without escort, and not one of them turned away. Torpedo Squadron 3 was still fighting for its life when the dive bombers came over the top. The phases of that morning were not sequential. They overlapped, and they were still overlapping when the battle ended. At 17 minutes past 9, Nagumo made the decision that every account of this battle turns on. He is usually described as choosing between an immediate partial strike with whatever was ready and a properly assembled coordinated attack, and faulted for taking the second. The choice, as described, was not available to him, and the reason lies in how his navy had decided a carrier should fight. Imperial Japanese Navy carrier doctrine was built around the coordinated full deckload strike. Attack bombers, dive bombers, and fighters went out together, arrived together, and attacked together, because a fraction of an air group arriving alone against a defended enemy achieves very little and is destroyed doing it. The Japanese had learned that in China and had built their entire carrier procedure around avoiding it. Aircraft were spotted on deck as a complete strike package, or they were not spotted at all. There was no established method for launching a partial strike, no doctrine for it, no practice at it. Nagumo also had a returning Midway strike overhead, running low on fuel, that had to be recovered before anything could be spotted, because a carrier can land aircraft or launch them but not both. Refusing to recover them meant putting 100 aircraft and their crews into the sea in order to send off a fragment of a strike that his own doctrine said would be destroyed on arrival. Measured against the procedures he and his air staff had trained in for a decade, one course of action was open to him: recover the returning aircraft, complete the ordnance change, put a full coordinated strike into the air as a single package, and then go and find the American carrier with everything at once. He gave that order. It was correct under the doctrine he had, and the doctrine was the problem. 3 American dive bomber groups launched that morning to find the Japanese carriers. Only 2 of them arrived. The Hornets dive bombers, 30-odd aircraft, flew a course that took them past the enemy without ever making contact. They searched, ran short of fuel, and turned for home. Some reached the ship, some came down in the water, some diverted to Midway. They played no part in the battle at all. This is why the number of American dive bombers over the Japanese fleet that morning was 50 rather than 80-odd. And it is worth saying plainly, because the arithmetic of what those 50 aircraft achieved only makes sense once you know that a third of the striking force never got there. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading the Enterprise group, reached the position where the Japanese were supposed to be and found empty ocean. He was the air group commander, he was new to the job, and his fuel state was already marginal. The correct and expected decision was to turn for the carrier. He began a box search instead, flying outward along a new leg into water where nothing at all had been reported. On that second leg, he sighted a single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, running north at high speed. She had been detached to hold down an American submarine and was now hurrying to rejoin the fleet. McClusky turned to follow her course. At 22 minutes past 10, 33 Dauntlesses from the Enterprise came over the Japanese carriers from the southwest, and within moments 17 more from the Yorktown arrived from a different bearing entirely. Neither group knew the other was coming. What followed immediately was a mistake. American doctrine for 2 squadrons attacking 2 targets was straightforward. The trailing squadron takes the near ship. The leading squadron takes the far one. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing 6, had positioned himself accordingly and was beginning his approach on the near carrier, the Akagi, expecting Scouting 6 to go past him to the Kaga. Instead, McClusky, leading from Scouting 6, took his own squadron down onto the near ship, and most of Best's squadron followed the aircraft in front of them. The result was that the Kaga received an entire air group's worth of bombs. She was hit so many times in so short a span that the Japanese lost count of the hits, and no reliable figure has ever been established. Best broke off his dive. He had 2 wingmen with him and nobody else, and he took those 2 aircraft across to the Akagi and attacked her with 3 bombs against a ship of 40,000 tons. That is what killed the flagship of the Pearl Harbor strike force. Off to the northeast, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie brought Bombing 3 down on the Soryu. 4 of his 17 aircraft, including his own, had lost their bombs into the sea on the way out when faulty electric arming switches released them. Leslie dived anyway, without a bomb, ahead of the 13 aircraft that still had theirs, using his machine guns against the ship's anti-aircraft positions to make the runs behind him a fraction easier. The first bomb struck the flight deck squarely on the painted rising sun. Now the part the memoir got wrong. There were no flight decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft waiting to take off. The Japanese official history is explicit about it, and Japanese naval records confirm it. Not one of Nagumo's carriers had a strike ranged on deck. The aircraft were below, in the hangars, in the middle of an ordnance change, with the previous load of weapons not yet struck down to the magazines because the crews were working against the clock, and stowing ordnance properly takes time nobody had. That is why 3 carriers died from a handful of bombs. The bombs went through the flight decks and detonated inside enclosed hangar spaces containing aircraft, fuel lines, and loose ordnance. What followed was not a fire on a ship. It was a fire inside a sealed box full of explosives. American and Japanese carriers were built on opposite philosophies, and at Midway, the difference decided who survived being hit. Japanese fleet carriers used enclosed hangars, structurally integrated into the hull, sealed against the weather. It is an efficient arrangement. It gives you strength, it protects your aircraft, and it lets you service them in any conditions. It also means that when a bomb detonates inside one, the blast has nowhere to go but along the hangar, through the ship, and up through the elevators, and the pressure cannot be vented because there is nothing to vent it through. American carriers used open hangar sides. The hangar deck was a covered space with roll-up shutters, open to the air. In a fire, the sides could be opened and the blast and the smoke could go out over the water. Aircraft could be pushed over the side. Fuel lines were drained and filled with inert gas as standard practice before action. Japanese damage control training was also thinner. Fire parties were smaller, less thoroughly drilled, and the equipment was not as good. Men died at their posts on all 4 of those ships, fighting fires that could not be fought, and the reason they could not be fought had been settled years earlier, in budget meetings, by men who never went to sea in these ships. Underneath that sits a difference about what a navy thinks a carrier is for. The Imperial Japanese Navy treated the carrier as a weapon of the first strike. Get the aircraft off, hit first, hit hardest, and settle the engagement before the enemy can reply. A ship built around that idea prioritizes how many aircraft it carries and how fast it can put them into the air. Armor over the hangar deck, redundant fire mains, compartmentalization that makes the hangar awkward to work in, all of it competes with those 2 things. And all of it was trimmed. The United States Navy had gone the other way, largely because of fleet exercises through the 1930s in which carriers repeatedly demonstrated how easy they were to find and how quickly they died once found. American carriers were designed on the assumption that they would be hit, and the design brief treated surviving the hit as part of the ship's job, rather than a failure of it. The Kaga, the Soryu, and the Akagi were finished by a weight of bombs that would not have stopped an American carrier of the same generation. Those were not badly built ships. They were built for a war in which they would always be the ones striking first, and on the 4th of June they were not. The first 2 sank that afternoon. The Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled before dawn. The officer who wrote the memoir was Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and who was aboard the Akagi at Midway, unable to fly after an operation. His book was published in English in the 1950s and became the foundation of the American understanding of the Japanese side of this battle. 2 generations of historians built on it. It supplied the packed flight decks, the 5 minutes, and the specific cinematic detail that made the scene so easy to picture and so hard to dislodge. Japanese historians have been considerably blunter about Fuchida than American ones, and the scholarly assessment now is that his account is unreliable in its particulars and invented in places. Nagumo's own battle report, meanwhile, was written by men with an obvious interest in how the loss of 4 carriers would be read in Tokyo. I find it worth sitting with the fact that the most widely believed account of the most studied battle in the Pacific War rested for half a century on the testimony of one man who had every reason to shape it, and that the correction came not from any new discovery, but simply from reading what the Japanese Navy had written down at the time. 1 Japanese carrier was still undamaged. The Hiryu had been operating somewhat apart from the other 3, and at midday she launched. Her first strike was dive bombers, and they found the Yorktown. 3 bombs hit. 1 went down the funnel and put out the boilers, and the ship came to a stop, with smoke pouring out of her, dead in the water, in the middle of an ocean where being stopped is a death sentence. The Yorktown's damage control parties then did something that deserves to be better known than it is. Working in a ship that was on fire and had no power, they patched the flight deck, restored steam to the boilers, and had her underway again inside an hour, making better than 15 knots. When the second Japanese strike arrived, torpedo bombers this time, the Yorktown was moving and fighting, and her attackers reported her as an undamaged carrier. They believed they had found a second ship, which meant the Japanese now thought the Americans had 3 carriers in the area rather than 2. The torpedoes did what the bombs had not. 2 hit on the port side, the ship lost power again, and she took on a list steep enough that Fletcher ordered her abandoned. She stayed afloat for 2 more days before a Japanese submarine finished her. The Hiryu had put 1 American carrier out of the battle with 2 strikes in an afternoon, having been left alone against a fleet that outnumbered her. Her air group did that with aircraft and crews that had already flown a full mission that morning. The Yorktown's own scout aircraft found the Hiryu shortly after the second strike went in. Spruance launched from the Enterprise at a little after 3 in the afternoon. 24 dive bombers, most of them survivors of the morning attack, several of them flown by pilots who had already been shot at over this same fleet 6 hours earlier and had come back and been rearmed and gone out again. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led them, and Best flew with them on what was his second attack on a Japanese carrier in a single day. They came in out of the sun at 5 o'clock. The Hiryu's fighter cover was up but out of position, and 4 bombs went into her forward flight deck. The forward elevator was blown out of its well and thrown against the bridge. She burned through the night and was scuttled the next morning. 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been sunk in a single day by aircraft flying from 3 American ones. The exchange rate came down to 3 things: where the aircraft were stowed when the bombs arrived, how the ships were built to absorb a hit, and which admiral had known in advance where the other fleet would be. Yamamoto held the fleet in the area overnight, hoping to draw the Americans into a surface action where his battleships would matter. Spruance declined, kept his distance, and gave him nothing. 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Mikuma and the Mogami, collided while maneuvering to avoid an American submarine during the withdrawal and were caught by carrier aircraft the following day. The Mikuma was destroyed. Yamamoto ordered the operation cancelled and the fleet withdrawn on the 5th of June. The most durable belief about Midway is that it destroyed Japan's irreplaceable body of elite naval aviators, and that Japanese carrier aviation never recovered because the men were gone. The numbers do not say that. Japanese aircrew losses at Midway were around 110, which is roughly a quarter of the aircrew embarked in the four carriers, and it is a considerably smaller figure than most people expect. Japan's Carrier Aviator Corps was gutted, but it was gutted the following year in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign, not in one morning in June. What Japan lost in numbers at Midway was something less visible and much harder to replace. 4 aircraft carriers went down with their entire ship's companies of aircraft maintenance personnel: the mechanics, the armorers, the electricians, the ordnance handlers, the men who kept 100 aircraft serviceable in a steel hangar in the middle of an ocean. Those men were trained over years, they existed in finite numbers, and Japan had no system for producing them in quantity. Aircraft could be built, pilots could be trained, badly and quickly, and were. The technical corps that kept carrier aviation functioning could not be reconstituted at all. For the rest of the war, Japanese carrier air groups suffered from serviceability rates that a 1942 air group would not have recognized. A squadron with 30 aircraft on paper might put 18 into the air, and the 18 would be the ones that happened to be working that week. Engines went unrebuilt, radios went unrepaired. Damage that a first-rate maintenance section would have turned around overnight took days, or was simply written off and the aircraft pushed aside. None of that shows up in an order of battle. A staff officer counting hulls and airframes would have concluded that Japanese carrier aviation had substantially recovered by 1943. What he could not count was the number of men aboard who genuinely knew how to keep a carrier air group flying at sea, and that number never came back. That was the wound, and it was inflicted by American bombs falling into hangar decks full of the men who worked there. 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen were killed in the operation. Set the aviator figure against that total, and the shape of the loss becomes clear. The overwhelming majority of the dead had never flown anything. They were ship's companies, and inside the ship's companies of those 4 carriers was the entire embarked technical establishment of the Imperial Navy's 1st Carrier Division. Yamamoto had come to Midway in order to force a decisive engagement while the balance still favored him. He got his decisive engagement. What he had actually gambled was not 4 ships, but the trained core of an arm that Japan had spent 15 years assembling, and it went down inside the hulls in a single afternoon. 4 reasons, and every one of them was in place before the first aircraft took off. Japan divided its force across thousands of miles, so that at the decisive moment 4 carriers fought alone, while the rest of the fleet was elsewhere. Japanese carrier doctrine required a full coordinated strike and made no provision for launching a partial one, which put the aircraft below decks at the moment the American dive bombers arrived. Japanese carrier design used enclosed hangars, and Japanese damage control was less well-resourced, so that a small number of hits produced fires that could not be contained. And Yamamoto attacked a numerically superior force at the far end of his own supply lines, on the strength of an operations order that had already decided the enemy would not fight. The Americans, for their part, read the mail, arranged to be in the right place, and sent everything they had. 307 Americans were killed at Midway. They died in cockpits, in engine rooms, on an atoll under bombardment, and in the water alongside a sinking destroyer 2 days after the Japanese carriers had gone down. A great many of the aircrew among them were lost in the first 2 hours of the 4th of June, flying obsolete machines without escort, and achieving nothing that showed on any chart that day. If your father or your grandfather served in the Pacific, on a flight deck, in a hangar, in an engine room, in a squadron that nobody has written a book about, leave his name in the comments. Leave his unit. Leave whatever part of his story you still carry. This is a good place for it. June 4th, 1942, a carrier deck in the Pacific. A Japanese officer stands with a pen in his hand, writing down another of the morning's victories. His navy has not lost a battle in 6 months, and far above him, past clouds he has no reason to look up at, the thing that is about to erase that navy is already there. Unseen, all morning the Americans have come at his fleet, wave after wave, low over the water, and all morning he has watched them fail and fall and burn. He writes each one down. Attack repelled, attack repelled. He is sure he is winning, and he is right, for about 5 more minutes. How does the best morning in the history of a navy become its worst, in the time it takes to finish a paragraph? You already know how the battle ended. That was never the question. The question is what this one man could see from where he stood, and the one thing, right in front of him, that he never saw coming. He was writing it down as it happened. He just didn't know what he was writing. His name was Takahisa Akagi. He was the air officer aboard the carrier Kaga, and on the morning of June 4th, his job was to keep the record of the sky. Every plane that went up, every plane that came back, every report that reached the deck from the ships around him. It was a good job for a careful man, and Akagi was a careful man. You can picture the deck below him, the morning sun already high, the sea calm and open in every direction, sailors moving with the ease of men who have done this 100 times and never once been wrong. A carrier at work is a kind of clockwork. Planes spotted and ranged, engines run up, men in colored jerseys moving through a dance they know in their bones, each one trusting the next to do his part exactly the way he has always done it. That morning, the clockwork was running clean. Men who have been winning for 6 months carry themselves a certain way. There is a looseness in it, an ease, orders given quietly and followed at once, the steady confidence of a crew that has never yet had a reason to doubt the deck beneath its feet, or the man standing next to it. You would have felt it the moment you came aboard. It was in the air of that ship, the way the salt was. There was no fear on that deck. There was no reason for any. The page in front of Akagi told a simple story, and every line of it was correct. The strike they had sent against the island that morning had gone out and come home. The enemy planes that had found the fleet had been met and beaten and sent into the sea. The sky was theirs, the water was theirs, the morning was theirs. A careful man reads his own account, and this one said one word, over and over, in a hand that did not shake: winning. And the calm on that deck had roots that ran back much further than that single morning. That book did not begin on the morning of June 4th. It began 6 months earlier, and it had never once been interrupted. At Pearl Harbor, this same fleet had crossed 4,000 miles of empty ocean in radio silence and struck the American battle line where it lay at anchor, then slipped away over the horizon before the smoke had cleared. Then Wake Island, then Rabaul, then Darwin on the northern coast of Australia, where the bombs came down on a harbor that had told itself it was too far south to ever be touched. Then west, all the way into the Indian Ocean, where this same fleet chased another empire's navy out of its own home waters and sank its ships almost as an afterthought. 6 months, a quarter of the way around the world. And in all of that time, against every navy that came at them, these carriers had not lost a single one of their number. Not one. The men on these ships were not the kind who bragged. They did not have to be. At that moment, they were very likely the finest carrier force in the world, the best trained crews, the most experienced pilots, flying from the decks that had already done what no navy in history had ever done. And there was something older and deeper than experience holding that confidence up. For the better part of 40 years, the Japanese Navy had trained for a single idea: One great battle. One morning when the enemy fleet would be found, and met, and destroyed in open water, the way they had destroyed the Russian fleet a generation before. In a victory the whole nation still taught its children. Every admiral in that navy had grown up on that story. That was the dream this navy had been built around. Everything in it, the ships, the guns, the training, the pride, pointed toward that one decisive morning. And on June 4th, from where Akagi stood, it looked as though the dream was finally coming true. The enemy had come to them. The enemy was being destroyed. The record was writing itself out exactly the way that doctrine had promised it would. That is the cruelest part of all of it. He was not misreading the morning by the standards he had been handed. He was reading it perfectly. The standards were the trap. So when Akagi stood on the Kaga and watched the Americans come and fail and watched his fleet hold, he was simply reading the newest line in a book that had never once told a lie. He had every reason on earth to believe the next line would read like all the others. That is what makes what happened next so hard to look away from. The Americans came at the fleet in waves all morning long, and each wave was worse for the men flying it than the one before. First came the planes from the island itself, early, before the day was fully warm. They came in, and they were thrown back. Then, as the morning wore on, came the ones that would decide everything, though no one on either side knew it yet: the torpedo planes. What it took to fly one of these attacks is the heart of the whole story. A torpedo has to be dropped low and slow and straight. There is no other way to do it. The plane has to come down almost to the surface of the sea, hold a steady line, and fly directly at a ship that is doing everything in its power to kill it. For long seconds, the pilot cannot turn. He cannot climb. He can do nothing but hold that line and pray. The American torpedo squadrons flew these attacks that morning without a single fighter to protect them. The men who led them knew exactly what that meant. One squadron commander took his men down toward the Japanese fleet, fully understanding that most of them, perhaps every last one of them, were not coming back, and they followed him anyway, in a straight line, into the guns. Think about what that asks of a man. Not a single flash of courage, a long-held, deliberate courage, seconds stretching out while the fire comes up to meet you, and the only thing you are allowed to do is keep flying straight at the thing that is killing you, because to turn away is to make the whole sacrifice mean nothing. They did not turn away. From the deck of the Kaga, it must have looked almost like a mistake, like watching men walk willingly into a fire. These planes had no chance, and every sailor at every gun could see it. The Japanese fighters fell on them from above. The guns of every ship in the fleet came around and opened up, and the torpedo planes came apart over the water, one after another, and went into the sea, squadron after squadron. First one carrier's planes, then another's, then a third's, over the better part of an hour. Almost none of the men in them lived. Akagi wrote it down. Attack repelled. Another squadron bored in. The same thing happened. Attack repelled. And here is what not one man on that deck could see. Those low, doomed, hopeless-looking attacks were not the failure they appeared to be. They were part of the reason the sky was about to fall in. To meet those planes down on the water, the Japanese fighters had come down too, all of them, down low, spread out of position, and, after a long morning of killing, low on fuel and low on ammunition. The high air, the air that a dive bomber falls out of, had been left open. Nobody had planned it that way. The Americans, still climbing far above, did not even know it had happened. It was not a scheme. It was the accidental price of an hour of slaughter. But the door had been left open, and it was the men in the torpedo planes, the men now going into the sea who had left it open. They died buying something they would never live to see. One of them was a young pilot who had already dropped his torpedo, taken his hits, and gone down into the water in the very middle of the Japanese fleet. He was alive down there, wounded, hidden, holding on. The officer on the deck above never knew he was there. Remember him. We are going to come back to him. Those men in the torpedo planes never knew what their attack set up. Most of them never came home to find out. If you think they have earned a few seconds of being remembered, take one of those seconds right now and tap the like button. It is a small thing, but it is one of the ways a story like theirs stays out loud instead of going quiet. Now, back to the deck. The officer is still writing. He has about 3 minutes. The first thing that was wrong was the quiet, not silence. A carrier at battle stations is never silent. But something in the rhythm of the morning had slipped, the way a familiar song slips when one note comes in a half-beat late. The fighters that had filled the air with noise were somewhere else now, down low, off across the water, chasing the last of the torpedo planes, far from the ships they were supposed to be guarding. For a stretch of minutes, the sky directly over the fleet had almost no one minding it. Somewhere on the deck, a man tilted his head back and looked up. Maybe he shouted, maybe he only pointed, and could not find the breath to say what he saw. On the ships of that fleet, there was no machine that could look into the high air for him. No radar, nothing that reached up past the clouds to warn a captain what was already on its way down. There was only a man's eyes, and the sky, and however many seconds were left in it. Seconds. That is what it came down to in the end. Not the 6 months, not the 4,000 miles, not the decades of doctrine. Just a handful of seconds, and whether anyone happened to be looking up into the one part of the sky that no one had thought to watch, Akagi may have glanced up himself. A careful man would have. And then, most likely, he looked back down at his record, because the record was still true, and the morning was still theirs, and there was still a line to finish. The pen kept moving. High above the Kaga, an American named Wade McClusky had brought his dive bombers over the fleet, looked down, found the enemy carriers with no one guarding the air above them, and tipped over into his dive. The men on the deck had a handful of seconds left. They did not know it yet, but they did. I have read a great deal about those 5 minutes over the years, and the detail that has always stayed with me is not the bombs. It is that a man had just finished writing the word for victory and never got to write the next line. What happened to the Kaga happened fast, too fast to lay out in order, because the men who lived it could not have told you the order of things either. One moment, the deck was a place where a careful officer kept a careful record. The next moment, the world tilted. The sound arrived before the mind could put a name to it. The light changed. The steady deck stopped being steady. The bombs came down out of that open high air, the air no one had been watching, and they found a ship that had no answer left to give. Up on the bridge, the captain of the Kaga, a man named Jisaku Okada, did not survive the first minutes. The place from which the ship was commanded was simply gone, and the record, the careful record, the true record, the 6-month record that had never once had to write the word lost, it went with it, into smoke, into a heat that no pen and no paper survive. Akagi lived. The air officer, the man who had spent his whole morning writing down victories, came through those first terrible minutes when so many around him did not, and because the men above him were gone, what was left of the ship became his to command. Think about that turn for a moment. The last thing he had done as a keeper of records was write that his side was winning. The first thing he did as a commander of men was try to save a ship that could not be saved. In the space of about 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's carriers had been torn open to the sky. The Kaga, the Akagi, flagship of the whole fleet, the Soryu. And Akagi was not the only man keeping that book. On every one of those ships, that same morning, someone else was writing the same word he was. An officer on the Akagi, an officer on the Soryu. Careful men, honest men, all of them reading the same true page and reaching the same true conclusion. They were all winning. Every one of them was right, and every one of those records ended within minutes of the others, in the same smoke, under the same open sky. By that same evening, a 4th carrier would follow the first 3. For a few hours, that 4th ship, the Soryu, fought on alone. She had been just far enough from the others to slip the first blow, and her own plane struck back hard, and for a little while the men aboard her may have let themselves believe the morning could still be pulled back from the edge. It could not. Late in the day, the same open sky found her too. One by one, all through that long afternoon, the ships that had carried the pride of a navy across the world went dark and began to burn. The force that had crossed a quarter of the earth without losing a single carrier lost 4 of them between breakfast and dark. And the hardest part, the part that is almost too neat to be believed, is that the record had been right, all the way up to the final line. They really had been winning, right up until the instant they were not. What came after the noise was a different kind of hard. A ship that is dying does not die all at once. It gives its crew time to fight for it, and slowly, time to understand that the fight is already lost. Akagi had that time. He led men back toward the fires to do what could still be done, to save the ship that had been the solid ground under his feet only an hour before, back when that ground had felt like the safest place in the entire world. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. There is no record of what a man thinks while he does a thing like that. Akagi never left us one, and it would be wrong to invent one for him. But what was true is clear enough, whether he ever let himself put it into words or not. Every certainty he had carried onto that deck at sunrise was gone by the middle of the day. The book that had never lied had ended in the middle of a sentence. The sea that had been theirs was filling with their own ships, burning, and the quiet confidence of that entire fleet, all 6 months of it, had turned out to rest on one single thin assumption, that the next line would look like all the ones that had come before. By nightfall, the arithmetic was beyond any argument. The heart of the fleet was gone. The men who could not be replaced, the veteran crews, the trained hands, the pilots a nation had spent years building one at a time, were in the water or beneath it. 6 months of running wild had ended in 5 minutes of a single morning, and no line written in any book could put a word of it back. So here is the question we started with, and here, at last, is the answer. How does the best morning in the history of a navy become its worst, in the time it takes to finish a paragraph? It was never really about the battle. You knew the battle before you ever clicked on this. It was about the distance between what a record can measure and what is actually happening. Akagi's record was honest. Every line of it was true. The strike launched. The attacks repelled. The sea held. But a record can only ever write down what a man is able to see. And there was one thing that careful officer could not see: the open door up in the high air, and the men who had died to hold it open for the ones coming behind them. His instruments could not measure that. His doctrine could not imagine it. His own eyes could not reach that high. So he wrote victory. And he was telling the truth. And the truth was a trap. Now, that young pilot in the water, the one I asked you to remember, he had gone in with the torpedo planes. One of 15 his squadron flew off the carrier Hornet that morning, behind a commander who led them straight at the fleet. Of those 15 planes, of those 30 men, he was the only one who came back. Shot down, wounded in the arm and the leg, he had pulled himself free of a sinking plane in the middle of the enemy fleet and hidden in the open water beneath a seat cushion that floated loose, small enough and still enough that no one found him. And from down there, from inside the very fleet he had been sent to attack, he watched. He watched 3 of the carriers his squadron had come to attack. The Kaga, the Akagi, the Soryu, turn, one by one, into towers of black smoke that leaned up against the sky. He stayed in that water for 30 hours before an American flying boat finally spotted him and lifted him out. He was burned, and he was shot through, and he had spent a day and a night watching an enemy die all around him. And when they pulled him from the sea, he was still holding on. He would carry what he saw in that water for the rest of his life. He had been handed the strangest seat in the whole battle, a seat down inside the enemy's own fleet, low on the water, close enough to hear it happen, close enough to watch the smoke climb, and know exactly what it meant. He had done exactly the thing those men in the torpedo planes were sent to do. He had gone in against the odds. He had helped hold the door open. He had paid for it. And, almost alone among them, he had lived to see it work. The record on the Kaga never wrote his name. It never wrote down what he and his squadron had truly done, because the man keeping it could not see it, and by the time anyone on that ship might have understood, the record was already ash. But it happened. It is one of the truest things in this entire story. And the fact that his enemy's careful book never once recorded it does not make it one bit less true. It only tells you that the record was never the place where the truth was living. We tell this story from the deck of the Kaga for a reason. Not to stand in an enemy's shoes and feel sorry for him. He chose his war, and his navy chose the morning it sailed into. We tell it from up there because it is the only place you can truly see the size of what those American flyers did. You cannot measure it from the American side. From the American side, it looks like a run of terrible luck and a wave of good men lost. It is only from the enemy's own deck, from the pen of a man writing victory while his navy has minutes left to live, that you can see the truth of it plainly. The men who beat that fleet did not look, at the time, like they were winning. Right up to the end, they looked like they were losing. That was the disguise the whole thing wore, and it worked. Every carrier that burned that afternoon had sailed to that spot to fight one great battle and win it. They got their great battle. It simply belonged to someone else. And the men it belonged to, the ones in the low, slow planes, the ones who flew straight into the guns so that others could come falling out of the empty sky behind them, most of them never knew they had won anything at all. They were gone before the smoke even rose. That is the true shape of what happened over that ocean. Those men handed the war forward, at the highest price there is, and trusted the rest of us to understand, later, what they had done. That officer spent a morning writing down a war he was certain he understood. The one thing he never managed to write, the thing his book simply had no line for, was the men who reached up into an open sky and turned his entire morning over. Their names deserve to be said out loud. So let us keep saying them. That officer's morning survived because someone wrote it down. But some of the best stories from this war were never written down at all. They were told once, at a kitchen table, by a father or a grandfather who was there, and who only ever mentioned it the one time. If you carry a story like that, something he told you that you have never read in any book, put it in the comments below. Write it down here, where it won't disappear. Those men counted on us to remember them. Let's make sure we do.
Kaname Harada, June 4th, 1942. Somewhere over the Pacific, north of Midway Atoll. His carrier, the Soryu, is burning below him, black smoke pouring off the flight deck, flames where the aircraft used to be. He had taken off from that deck hours earlier. Now it is gone. He banks his Zero toward the Hiryu, the only Japanese carrier still afloat, and sets down on her flight deck. The maintenance crew takes one look at his plane. It is so full of holes, they order it pushed over the side. A spare Zero is brought up from below decks. Harada climbs in. A few hours later, American dive bombers find the Hiryu, too. Harada is in the air when it happens. He glances back, and a wall of hot air slams his aircraft sideways. The entire flight deck vanishes beneath fire and smoke. No place left to land. Anywhere. He fights until his ammunition runs out, then locks his canopy open, drops the flaps, and pushes the nose down. He pancakes into the sea beside a Japanese destroyer. His watch had stopped at 3:26 that afternoon. It would never move again. They pull him out of the water. He's alive. And here is the part that most people get wrong. Most of his fellow pilots are alive too. The standard story says Midway destroyed Japan's best pilots. It didn't. Out of roughly 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrews in the Japanese Navy, about 110 died at Midway, 36 on the carriers, 74 in the air. The rest were pulled from the water, transferred to destroyers, counted, and sent home. They survived the battle that changed the Pacific War. But within 12 months, nearly all of them were gone. Not because of what America did next, because of what Japan did. 5 minutes. That's all it took. American SBD Dauntless dive bombers came screaming down from 14,000 feet, while every Japanese Zero fighter was stuck at wave-top level, dragged down there by American torpedo bomber crews, who knew full well they were not coming back. 5 minutes later, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. The 4th was hit that afternoon. But the pilots, most of them, survived. And then Japan made 3 decisions that made that survival meaningless. June 14th, 1942. The anchorage at Hashirajima, in the inland sea of Japan. The surviving warships of the Japanese fleet slipped into port quietly. No ceremony, no flags, no bands playing on the dock, no victory celebration. The harbor that had sent them off with confidence 10 days earlier now received them in silence. The battleships and cruisers dropped anchor in their usual positions. But the spaces where the carriers should have been, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were empty. 4 of the finest aircraft carriers on Earth had sailed out of these waters. None of them came back. The wounded were moved off the ships immediately, transferred to naval hospitals on the mainland, and then they were classified as secret patients, placed in isolation wards, separated from other patients, barred from seeing their own families. Wives who came to the hospitals were turned away. Mothers received no information. The men who had just fought in one of the most important naval battles in history were locked behind closed doors, and the doors stayed shut for over a year. The Japanese public was told that Midway had been a great victory. The wounded knew otherwise. So Japan made them disappear. The healthy survivors got a different kind of silence. Officers and enlisted men were broken up and dispersed across the fleet, reassigned to other units, scattered. They were forbidden from visiting their families, forbidden from contacting friends. Many were shipped directly to bases in the South Pacific. Captain Kawaguchi, the senior air officer aboard the Hiryu, later told American interrogators that the surviving pilots were distributed between the carriers Zuikaku and Shikaku and various units across the Solomon Islands. Distributed. The word is precise, not reorganized, not reassigned with purpose. Distributed, the way you distribute spare parts. And here is what that silence actually cost Japan. The men who had just witnessed what American dive bombers could do, the men who understood, better than anyone alive. The fatal gap in Japanese fleet air defense were the exact men who could have reshaped Japanese carrier doctrine. They had seen the Zeros pulled down to sea level by the torpedo bombers. They had seen the sky above the fleet left wide open. They knew exactly how the American attack had worked. Japan silenced every one of them. The Navy did not tell the Army what had happened. The Army continued to believe that the carrier fleet was intact and fully operational. Decisions the Army made in the Solomon Islands, decisions that sent tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers into the jungle, were based on a lie. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top Zero aces, stationed at Lae in New Guinea, had no idea what had happened at Midway. None. He knew that an operation had been planned. He knew that Midway was supposed to be taken. But no one told him the fleet had lost 4 carriers. No one told him the Kido Butai, the striking force that had owned the Pacific since December, no longer existed. He only began to suspect a disaster when American forces landed on Guadalcanal 2 months later. How could the Americans go on the offensive, he wondered, if Midway had been a victory? He and his fellow pilots at Lae could only whisper among themselves. No official word came down. No briefing. No explanation. The whispers were all they had. And because the Army did not know the truth, it continued to make plans as though the Navy could still control the sea and the sky. Reinforcements were sent to Guadalcanal by transport ship without adequate air cover, because the Army believed air cover was available. It was not. Those transports sailed into waters that the Japanese Navy could no longer protect, and the men aboard them paid for a lie they had never been told, and not a single flag officer was held accountable. Vice Admiral Nagamo, the man who commanded the carrier striking force when all 4 carriers were destroyed, was given command of the rebuilt carrier force. According to post-war accounts, the reason was simple. Nagamo had reported sinking 2 American carriers at Midway. The actual number was 1, the Yorktown. But the lie was good enough to protect his career. Now, here is where the numbers matter, and where most people, even those who know Midway well, get the story wrong. The battle was devastating. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors lost their lives, most of them while trying to save their ships. Damage control parties trapped below decks, engine room crews scalded by ruptured steam lines. Ordnance men caught in the chain explosions of armed aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip in the hangars. More than 700 aircraft technicians and maintenance specialists went down with the carriers. These were not men who could be replaced by running an ad in the newspaper. Pre-war Japan was far less mechanized than the United States. The percentage of the population with technical and mechanical training was a fraction of America's. Those 700 men represented a generation of institutional knowledge: how to arm a torpedo bomber in rough seas, how to spot aircraft on a pitching flight deck, how to keep Zeros flying 3,000 miles from the nearest factory. That knowledge sank with them. All 248 carrier aircraft were destroyed. Most never left the hangar decks. They burned where they sat. The carriers, irreplaceable. The technicians, irreplaceable. The aircraft, replaceable, but only with time. And the pilots? The men Japan had spent years training to the highest standard on Earth. They were still alive. Japan had one chance to rebuild around them, to take the only asset it could not manufacture and protect it. Instead, Japan chose to burn them. There's a pattern in every military collapse I've studied. The moment an institution starts hiding from its own people what the enemy just did to them, it has already decided to lose. It just hasn't admitted it yet. Japan had silenced its own survivors. That was the first decision. The second was worse. The surviving pilots needed somewhere to go. Japan had 2 fleet carriers left, the Zuikaku and the Shokaku. Both had missed Midway. Shokaku was still in dry dock repairing bomb damage from the Coral Sea. Zuikaku was untouched, but her air group had been shot to pieces there, and the Japanese Navy refused to transfer Shokaku's surviving air crews to fill the gaps. So both stayed home while the Kido Butai sailed to its destruction without them. Some of the surviving Midway veterans were reassigned to those ships. They would fly again from carrier decks. But many others, men who had flown every major operation since Pearl Harbor, were not put aboard carriers. They were sent to land-based air units. Sent south. Sent to the one place in the Pacific where the fighting was about to become the most intense and the most unforgiving, Rabaul. A Japanese airbase on the northern tip of New Britain, deep in the South Pacific. From Rabaul, Japanese pilots flew missions against one target above all others, Guadalcanal. And this is where Japan's second decision turned into a death sentence. The distance from Rabaul to Guadalcanal was over 600 miles. One way. For a Zero fighter, that was close to the absolute outer limit of its combat range. A pilot taking off from Rabaul at dawn would fly for more than 4 hours just to reach the airspace over Guadalcanal. 4 hours of open ocean. 4 hours of burning fuel. By the time he arrived, if the weather held, if he found the island, his fuel tanks gave him maybe 10 to 15 minutes of combat before he had to turn around and fly 4 hours back. 15 minutes. That was the window. Miss it by 5 minutes and the Pacific swallowed you. American pilots at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal had a very different problem. Their problem was that they were too close. A Wildcat could be airborne and over the fight within minutes. Full fuel, full ammunition, rested. And if a Wildcat took damage, the pilot could glide back to Henderson Field, land on a dirt strip, and be up again the next day in a repaired aircraft. A Zero pilot with a damaged engine over Guadalcanal had over 600 miles of empty ocean between him and the nearest friendly mechanic. The math was unforgiving. Japan was sending its best pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor, of Midway, of the Indian Ocean raids, into combat at the end of a 600-mile fuel line against American pilots who were fighting over their own airfield. Every engagement favored the Americans. Every damaged aircraft favored the Americans. Every wounded pilot favored the Americans. The exchange rate was built into the geography, and nothing Japan did could change it. On August 7th, 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, and the skies over the Solomon Islands became the place where Japan's surviving elite went to die. The Eastern Solomons. August 1942. Casualty rates among Japanese aviators matched what they had suffered at Midway. Santa Cruz. October 1942. The same. Japanese officers later told American interrogators that the surviving Midway pilots participated in the Battle of Santa Cruz. They noted that pilot quality had already begun to decline due to heavy attrition. Over 1,000 Japanese aircraft were lost during the Solomon Islands campaign. 1,000. And the men flying them were not replacements. Not yet. They were the veterans. The men who had been flying Zeros since before the war started. The men Japan could not replace. The Solomons did not just consume aircraft. It consumed the last generation of Japanese pilots who knew what they were doing. And one of them was Kaname Harada. July 1942. Harada was reassigned to the carrier Hio. In early October, the Hio sailed from Japan to join the Guadalcanal campaign. October 17th, 1942. Harada was part of a fighter escort protecting a force of torpedo bombers heading toward Guadalcanal. American F-4F Wildcats hit the formation. Harada probably downed one of them. Then he took a round in the left arm His zero was shattered. He crash-landed near the Japanese base at Rakata Bay on Santa Isabel Island. The aircraft came apart around him. He was pinned underneath the wreckage. He dug himself out with his bare hands. His fingernails tore off. He could see bone through the torn skin of his fingers. When he finally pulled himself free, he was alone, bleeding, in a jungle he had never seen before. He walked for days, through dense tropical forest, through rain. He contracted malaria, then dengue fever. He found the body of a Japanese bomber crewman who had also gone down. Another crewman was still alive, but barely. His injuries were beyond help. The dying man asked Harada to cut some of his hair and take it back to his family. Harada stayed with the man until he was gone. That delay, it turned out, saved Harada's life. It kept him from walking into the path of an American patrol. He eventually reached a Japanese midget submarine base and was evacuated on a hospital ship back to Japan. His flying career was over. One arm was too badly damaged. He would never fly combat again. He was 26 years old. 4 months earlier. He had been one of the finest fighter pilots on Earth. Now he was a flight instructor with a ruined arm and a watch that would never move past 326. Now, here is the contrast that matters. America lost pilots at Midway, too. In some squadrons, the losses were staggering. Worse, in percentage terms, than anything the Japanese suffered in the air that day. Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the carrier Hornet, 15, TBD, Devastator torpedo bombers, 30 men, 15 pilots, and 15 rear seat gunners. They flew straight into the Japanese fleet without fighter escort. The Zeros came down on them like a wall. The Devastators were slow, underpowered, practically defenseless against a Zero in a diving attack. One by one, they went into the water. 29 men did not come back. One man survived. Ensign George Gay. Shot down, wounded. He floated alone in the Pacific with his life vest and watched from the water as American dive bombers destroyed the Japanese carriers. He was picked up the next day. VT-8's loss was devastating, but what the United States Navy did next made all the difference. America did not hide what happened. It studied it. Every after-action report was collected, read, analyzed, argued over. What went wrong with torpedo doctrine? Why the coordination between fighters and bombers failed? What changes needed to be made to aircraft, to tactics, to communications? The losses were treated as data, painful, expensive data, and the data was used. And America did not scatter its surviving veterans across the Pacific to fight alone until they were used up. It did not pretend the battle had never happened. It did not silence the men who had been there. The difference between the two navies after Midway was not technology. It was not courage. Both sides had plenty of both. The difference was what each side did with the truth, and with the men who carried it. If your father, your grandfather, or anyone you ever knew served in the Pacific, or anywhere in that war, hit the like button. This story is for them. Before the war, the Japanese Navy had built the most selective pilot training program on Earth. The numbers tell the story. When Kaname Harada entered the program, according to one account, 1,500 men signed up. 26 completed it. 4 years of physical punishment, constant testing, and elimination. The men who survived the pipeline emerged as extraordinary aviators, skilled, disciplined, conditioned for carrier operations. But the system had a flaw that nobody cared about in peacetime. It could not scale. The program was designed to produce a small number of elite pilots for a fleet that expected short, decisive wars, high quality, low volume, no surge capacity, no backup plan. When Japan went to war, It had roughly 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrews. That was supposed to be enough. After Midway and the Solomons, the Navy needed hundreds of replacement pilots immediately. The system that had taken 4 years to produce 26 men was now being asked to produce hundreds in months. It broke. Japan pushed recruits through abbreviated training programs. Flight hours were slashed. Where pre-war Japanese pilots had trained for years, mastering formation flying, gunnery, navigation, carrier landings in all weather, the new men were getting weeks. They arrived at operational squadrons having barely learned to fly straight and level. Carrier landings were a terror. Gunnery was poor. Navigation over open ocean, the single most critical skill for a Pacific pilot, was almost non-existent. And then the fuel ran out. American submarines were strangling Japan's oil supply. The Maru ships, the tankers that carried crude oil from the Dutch East Indies back to Japan, were being torpedoed at an accelerating rate. Every tanker that went to the bottom took fuel with it. Fuel for warships, fuel for aircraft, and fuel for training. By 1943, training airfields in Japan were rationing aviation gasoline. New pilots sat on the ground while their fuel allotments were diverted to frontline units. When they did fly, the hours were short, the conditions controlled, and the skills they needed most, combat maneuvering, deflection shooting, low-altitude carrier recovery, went unpracticed. Training aircraft remained a low-production priority throughout the entire war. Japan built fighters and bombers for combat. It did not build the trainers needed to create the pilots to fly them. Captain Kawaguchi, in his post-war interrogation, laid it out clearly. Pilot quality deteriorated because of insufficient training facilities, massive attrition, and a shortage of fuel. The Navy was forced to use inadequately trained replacements, and Japan never rotated its veterans home to teach. That single decision, or rather, that single refusal, made everything else irrelevant. The experienced pilots stayed in combat. They flew mission after mission, week after week, until they were gone. The knowledge they carried, how to manage fuel over long missions, how to coordinate attacks on enemy carriers, how to survive against radar-directed American fighters, went with them. None of it was passed down. None of it was captured. It simply vanished, one pilot at a time. The American Navy did the opposite. The United States massively expanded its pilot training infrastructure, new airfields across the American South and Southwest, new schools, thousands of new instructors. And the most important decision of all, combat veterans were rotated home and placed in training commands. A man who had survived the Coral Sea taught young pilots what it felt like to have a zero on your tail. A man who had lost his squadron leader at Midway explained what happens when your formation breaks apart. A man who had fought above the jungles of Guadalcanal showed students how to use cloud cover, how to conserve ammunition, how to break off an engagement when the odds turned. A young American pilot, arriving at his first squadron in 1944, had been taught by men who had actually been there. The lessons were not theoretical. They were personal, and they kept men alive. New American pilots entered combat with hundreds more flight hours than their Japanese counterparts. They flew better aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat replaced the F-4F Wildcat. The Hellcat was faster, tougher, climbed harder, and was built from the ground up to defeat the Zero. Their carriers were equipped with radar that could detect incoming raids at distances over 100 miles. Their fighter directors, officers who sat in darkened combat information centers staring at radar screens, could vector Hellcats onto Japanese formations before the enemy pilots even knew they were being tracked. By June 1944, 2 years after Midway, the gap between the two air forces was no longer a gap. It was an abyss. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19th and 20th, 1944. The largest carrier versus carrier engagement in history. 9 Japanese carriers against 15 American carriers. Over 1,300 carrier aircraft in the water. The Japanese launched 4 massive strike waves against the American fleet. What happened next was not a battle. It was a reckoning. American radar picked up the incoming Japanese formations at long range. Fighter directors calmly vectored Hellcats to intercept. The Japanese pilots, most of them with a handful of months' training, flew into disciplined formations of American fighters flown by men who had trained under Midway and Guadalcanal veterans. The result was lopsided, beyond anything either Navy had ever seen. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost nearly 600 aircraft in 2 days. The Americans lost 123, and most of those were lost not to enemy action, but to fuel exhaustion during a long-range evening strike. The Japanese pilots who flew those missions had minimal training, outdated tactics, and aircraft that could no longer compete. They flew straight into the most sophisticated carrier air defense system ever assembled. Radar, directed fighter intercepts, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, and they were swept from the sky. The system that had produced the finest carrier pilots on Earth in 1941, the system that had created Harada and Sakai and Maeda and every other ace who had dominated the Pacific skies for 6 months, had by 1944 produced men who struggled to land on their own flight decks. And that was the direct result of a choice. Japan chose not to rebuild, chose not to learn, chose not to protect the knowledge that its surviving veterans carried. America made the opposite choice. And 2 years later, the results were visible from horizon to horizon across the Philippine Sea. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm could no longer fight a conventional carrier battle. The pilots did not have the skill. The aircraft did not have the performance. The carriers did not have the planes. So Japan found a new use for its pilots. The Special Attack Force. Kamikaze. A pilot who could not aim a bomb could still aim a plane. That is what it came down to. Not spiritual devotion, though the propaganda said otherwise. Not ancient warrior codes, though the speeches invoked them. Mathematics. Cold. Simple mathematics. When an air force can no longer put ordnance on target through skill, when the pilots cannot hit a moving ship from altitude, cannot coordinate a torpedo attack, cannot survive long enough to line up a bomb run, the only variable left is the pilot's body. The plane becomes the bomb. The pilot becomes the fuse, and the training required drops to almost nothing. Fly toward the ship. Do not pull up. And that was the logical endpoint of 3 decisions. Silence the experience. Burn the veterans. Refuse to rebuild the system. Follow that sequence long enough, and you arrive at a place where young men with a few dozen hours of flight time are strapped into aircraft loaded with explosives and pointed at American ships. Takeshi Maeda knew what that looked like from the inside. Takeshi Maeda was a torpedo bomber pilot. On December 7th, 1941, he flew one of the aircraft that struck the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor. He was 20 years old. He remembered following Commander Fuchida's flare signal, forming up in single file for the torpedo run, and watching the anti-aircraft fire thicken as each plane went in. He was the second aircraft in line. His torpedo hit. The West Virginia took several more after his. She settled to the bottom of the harbor. Over the next 3.5 years, Maeda flew combat missions across the Pacific, battle after battle, island after island. He survived them all. Later in the war, at Okinawa, he was on a night attack against a group of American ships when flares lit up the water below. There, sitting in his bomb sight, was the West Virginia. the same ship he had hit at Pearl Harbor. The Americans had raised her from the mud, repaired her, and sent her back to fight. He could not believe it. By August 1945, Maeda had accumulated 3,800 hours of combat flight time. 3,800. That number is almost incomprehensible. It represents years in the cockpit, dozens of engagements, an accumulation of skill and instinct that no training program on Earth could replicate. More experience than nearly any pilot in any navy on either side of the war. And in August 1945, the Japanese Navy assigned him to the Special Attack Force. His words, recorded by the National World War II Museum. I had accumulated 3,800 hours of combat flying experience. I couldn't believe my commanders wanted to waste all that in a single mission. His flight was scheduled for August 16th, 1945. Japan surrendered on August 14th. 2 days. That was the margin. 3,800 hours. Every takeoff, every landing, every engagement from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to Okinawa. The full arc of the Pacific War compressed into one man's logbook. And the system that had kept him alive through all of it was about to spend him in a single dive. 2 days stood between Takeshi Maeda and an explosive-laden cockpit pointed at an American warship. 2 days stood between 3,800 hours of hard-won skill and a column of smoke on the water. And then there is Harada, the pilot whose watch stopped at 3:26 in the afternoon, somewhere in the Pacific north of Midway. After the war, Harada worked as a dairy farmer. He failed at nearly everything he tried. Selling apples, milking cows, laboring on other people's land. In 1965, his wife asked him a question. If you want to atone for the lives you have taken, what better way is there than to nurture new lives? He opened a nursery for children, then a kindergarten. He ran it for decades. In 1991, during the Gulf War, he overheard young Japanese people watching American airstrikes on television and describing the bombing as if it were a video game. Something broke in him. He resolved to speak out. He spent the next 25 years traveling to schools in Japan and the United States, telling anyone who would listen what war actually looked like from inside a cockpit. He traveled to the United States. He met Joe Foss, the American Marine ace who was believed to have been the pilot who shot him down over Guadalcanal. Foss's plane had taken 240 hits in that fight. The two men who had tried to destroy each other at point-blank range in 1942 sat across from each other decades later and talked about their children. They became friends. Harada went back to Santa Isabel Island and found the wreckage of his Zero still lying in the jungle where he had crashed. He brought a piece of it home. He opposed efforts to change Japan's pacifist constitution. He told audiences that the politicians pushing for change had been born after the war and did not understand what they were asking for. In this respect, he said, they are like our pre-war leaders. He worked at his kindergarten until he was 95. He died on May 3rd, 2016. He was 99 years old. He was the last known surviving combat pilot who had flown a Zero during the early battles of the Pacific War. The line from Midway to Kamikaze is not a mystery. It is not complicated. It does not require theories about culture or ideology or national character. It requires only the facts, laid end to end. June 1942. Japan's best carrier pilots survive 5 minutes of American dive bombing at Midway. June 14th, 1942. Japan classifies its own wounded as secret patients, silences the survivors, and scatters them across the Pacific. August through November 1942. America's Guadalcanal offensive grinds them down, one by one, at the end of a 600-mile fuel line they can never shorten. 1943. Japan's pilot training system collapses under the weight of losses it cannot replace and a fuel shortage it cannot solve. June 1944. The Philippine Sea. The Turkey Shoot. The gap between the two air forces is no longer a gap. It is an abyss. October 1944. The first kamikaze attacks. The body replaces the bomb. Skill is no longer required. Only obedience. It is a straight line. And it was drawn the day Japan decided to hide what American dive bombers did in 5 minutes. Most of the men who flew those dive bombers are gone now. The youngest World War II veterans are in their late 90s. And every year, we lose more of them. But their stories don't have to disappear with them. Maybe your grandfather flew in the Pacific and never talked about it. Maybe your father told you something once, at the kitchen table, late at night, that you've carried with you ever since. Maybe it was just one sentence, one name, one place he never wanted to go back to. Whatever it is, write it down in the comments. Because a story that lives only in one person's memory is one heartbeat away from being lost forever. And the men who lived it deserve better than that. Summer of 1942. A family in the United States opens a package from the Navy. Inside is a small reel of film, 8mm, the kind you thread into a home projector, the kind half the families in America had sitting on a closet shelf next to the Christmas ornaments. No letter, no explanation, just the film. They set up the projector in the living room, pull the curtains shut, turn off the lamp by the sofa. The machine clicks and hums that warm mechanical sound, and then light hits the wall. Their son appears. He is standing on the deck of an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He is laughing at something someone just said. He turns toward the camera and squints. The sun is behind whoever is holding the lens. He looks relaxed. He looks young. He looks like he hasn't slept enough but doesn't mind. Next to him, another pilot leans against the fuselage of a torpedo bomber and grins. Someone off-screen says something, and both men look at each other. The camera holds. That footage was shot a few hours before these men climbed into those planes and flew straight into the Japanese fleet at Midway. They never came back. 29 families received that same film. 29 reels of 8mm celluloid. Living rooms across the United States where someone threaded a strip of film into a projector and watched their son, their husband, their brother, alive, standing in the sun on the deck of a warship, knowing he was already gone. The man who shot that footage had just won 2 Academy Awards. He could have turned it into a newsreel, a propaganda film, a recruitment tool. He had the skill and the authority to do all of those things. He didn't do any of them. He made 1 copy for each family, and he never showed it to anyone else. If your father served in the Pacific, or your grandfather, go ahead and hit like on this one. Not for me. For the generation that stood on flight decks like that one and never made it home. The men in that footage belonged to Torpedo Squadron 8. VT-8. 15 torpedo bombers, 30 men, a pilot and a rear gunner in each plane, assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. And by the first week of June 1942, not a single one of them had ever flown a combat mission. Their planes were Douglas TB-D Devastators. The name made them sound formidable. They were not. The Devastator had been cutting edge in 1937. By 1942, it was a museum piece with wings. Top speed around 200 miles an hour, and that was without a torpedo hanging underneath, with a 2,000-pound Mark 13 torpedo bolted to the belly. The plane slowed to about 115 knots. At that speed, in a straight line, at low altitude, a Devastator was not an attack aircraft. It was a target. The men knew this. They had been promised replacements. The new Grumman TBF Avenger, bigger, faster, with real armor and a proper turret. The Avengers arrived at Pearl Harbor the day after the Hornet sailed for Midway. They went to war in the planes nobody wanted. George Gay was 25. Born in Waco, Texas, though the Depression had scattered his family across the state. His father lost his job in the oil business. For a while, young George lived with an aunt and uncle. He worked odd jobs, 10 cents an hour at a drugstore, stocking shelves, whatever kept him moving. He got into Texas A&M, joined the Coast Artillery ROTC, made the rifle team. 2 years in, the money ran out. He dropped out. A friend told him the Navy needed pilots. Gay figured he had nothing else going on, so he took the physical, passed, earned his wings at Pensacola, got assigned to VT-8 at Norfolk, Virginia, 1 month before the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor. In his diary, he kept one throughout the voyage, Gay was candid about the squadron, about the men, about the planes. He confided his hope that the Avengers would arrive before the fighting started. They didn't. Gay later said that Midway would be the first time he had ever carried a torpedo on an aircraft. The first time he had ever taken off from a carrier with a torpedo underneath him. Most of the ensigns were in the same position. The man who led them was 41. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, born in Fort Pierre, South Dakota. His father, Charles, was a rancher from colonial New Hampshire stock. Old families, old land. His mother, Jane Van Meter, was Lakota. Waldron grew up between two Americas, the ranch and the reservation, open plains in every direction. He left for Annapolis at 20. Class of 1924, earned his wings in 27. Over the next 14 years, he flew with torpedo squadrons, scouting squadrons, patrol squadrons. He instructed midshipmen at the academy. He studied ordnance at the Norden bomb sight factory in New York. He married a woman named Adelaide Wentworth. They had 2 daughters. The older one was named Nancy. By the time Waldron took command of VT-8 in the summer of 1941, he had more flight hours and more experience than anyone else in the squadron by a factor of years. His pilots were ensigns, boot officers, 22, 23 years old. He was old enough to be some of their fathers. He trained them the way you train men, when you know the margin for error is 0, and the equipment is going to let them down. He ran torpedo approaches over and over until the ensigns could do them in their sleep. He drilled navigation. He drilled formation discipline. He talked about the Japanese, how they fought, how they thought, where their carriers would likely be positioned. He studied their doctrine the way a chess player studies openings, not because he admired them, but because knowing the enemy's habits was the only advantage a squadron of devastators was ever going to have. He was blunt with his men. He didn't soften bad news. When the Avengers didn't arrive in time, he didn't pretend it didn't matter. He told them they were going to fly what they had, and he told them what that meant. But he was also loyal to them in a way that went past the textbook version of the word. Then there was Bill Evans, Wesleyan University, class of 1940, a college boy who joined the Navy and found himself aboard a carrier in the middle of the Pacific before his 24th birthday. On the night of December 7th, 1941, hours after Pearl Harbor, Evans wrote a letter home. It was published in Life magazine the following summer, and later reprinted in a 1943 collection called The Navy Reader. He was one of those men who wrote the way he talked, plainly, without decoration, and you could hear his voice through the ink. Evans was 23 when he climbed into a Devastator on the morning of June 4th. He didn't come back either. And there were 27 others, men whose names most Americans will never learn. Chief Radio Man Horace Franklin Dobbs, Waldron's own backseat man, the one who sat directly behind the skipper and watched the sky for fighters. Ensign Jeff Woodson, Ensign Hal Ellison, who had a wife named Audrey waiting back in the States. She would later write letters that still exist in the archives, letters addressed to men who would never read them, asking questions that would never be answered. Each of these men had a rear gunner sitting behind him, a radio man with a single .30 caliber machine gun mounted on a swivel. That gun was the only thing between them and a Zero coming in from behind at 300 miles an hour. One gun, one man, facing the finest fighter aircraft in the Pacific. These were the men in the footage, farm boys from the Midwest, a Texan who quit college for a cockpit, a college kid who wrote letters that read like literature, a commander whose mother had walked the same land the Lakota walked before the reservations drew lines across it, rear gunners who knew that when the Zeros came, they would be the first ones hit and the last ones able to do anything about it. 30 men, average age somewhere around 24. Most had never fired a weapon at another human being. None had ever dropped a torpedo in combat. Several had never even seen the ocean before they reported for duty. And in the days before the battle, the squadron's commanding officer was fighting a different kind of war entirely, one with his own air group commander. Stanhope Ring was tall, polished, and had spent most of his career in administrative positions. He was new to the Hornets air group. He was not a torpedo man. And his plan for the coming battle was built around the dive bombers and fighters, not the torpedo planes. Ring wanted the Wildcat fighters to fly high, above the dive bombers, to give them altitude advantage. The torpedo planes would go in low, unescorted. Waldron told Ring his men would be slaughtered without fighter cover. A Devastator flying low and slow through a swarm of Zeros with no one to protect it was not an attack run. It was a death sentence. Ring said the plan stood. On the night of June 3rd, Waldron gathered his squadron together for the last time. He handed out a mimeographed sheet of paper, his own words, carefully typed. He asked them to read it silently. I actually believe that under these conditions, we are the best in the world. My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation. But if we don't, and the worst comes to the worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. He looked at them as they read it. 30 men in a ready room, under fluorescent lights, reading a piece of paper that told them what was coming. Nobody spoke. When they finished, Waldron nodded and said, This is it. It will be, and I hope, a glorious event. Then he went to his quarters, sat down, and wrote a letter to Adelaide. I believe that we will be in battle very soon. I wish we were there today. But as we are up to the very eve of serious business, I wish to record to you that I am feeling fine. He sealed it. He did not tell her what he had just told his men. That letter reached Adelaide after the telegram. The morning of June 4th, 1942. 15 Devastators launched from the Hornets flight deck, one after another, into a sky that looked like it didn't know a war was about to pass through it. Gay was in the last slot, tail end Charlie, the rearmost plane in the formation. Once airborne, Commander Ring led the entire Hornet air group, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, on a heading due west. It was wrong. The Japanese carriers had been spotted to the southwest. Ring's heading would take the formation over empty ocean. Waldron knew it. He got on the radio. He argued. He tried to get Ring to change course. Ring wouldn't. Waldron had spent 14 years flying in the Pacific. He had studied Japanese tactics. He understood carrier doctrine. And he had something else, something no one could measure or teach. He knew where the enemy was. He felt it the way a man raised on open plains feels weather coming before the sky changes. He turned his squadron to the southwest. 15 Devastators broke away from the air group. No fighters above them, no dive bombers ahead of them. Just 15 slow, obsolete torpedo planes, flying low over the water, heading toward the largest Japanese naval force assembled since Pearl Harbor. They found it. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, screening ships in every direction, and above the fleet, a combat air patrol of more than 30 Mitsubishi Zeros, the fastest, most maneuverable fighter aircraft in the Pacific. The Zeros came down on them like a wave. One Devastator dropped, then another, then two more in quick succession. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening ships ripped through the formation from below, while the Zeros tore at it from above. Waldron's voice came over the radio one final time. "Watch those fighters. My two wingmen are going into the water." Gay looked over. He saw Waldron's Devastator trailing fire from the left wing fuel tank. He saw Waldron trying to stand up in the cockpit. His arms were moving, and then the plane nosed down and hit the ocean. It burned for a moment. Then the water closed over it. Gay was the last plane. His rear gunner called out that he'd been hit. Gay glanced back over his shoulder. The man was slumped forward in the rear cockpit. He wasn't moving. Gay was alone. He flew through the anti-aircraft fire anyway. He lined up his torpedo on the nearest carrier and released it at 800 yards. He pulled up and flew directly over the flight deck. Zeros hit him from every angle. Something tore through the controls. The engine seized. He went into the water. He managed to pull himself from the cockpit before the plane sank. He found a deflated rubber life raft bobbing nearby. He found a black seat cushion that had floated free. He held the cushion over his head and drifted. Japanese warships were passing him on both sides, close enough to hear voices. He stayed like that for hours, wounded in the hand, the arm, the leg. Salt water in every cut. The sun directly overhead. Japanese ships so close he could hear machinery turning. Once, a destroyer passed near enough that he could see sailors on the deck. He pressed his face into the cushion and didn't move. The hours stretched. The fleet moved around him like a living thing. Engines throbbing through the water, wakes churning white paths across the surface. He was a man floating in the middle of a machine, built to find and destroy him. And the only thing between him and discovery was a piece of rubber the size of a dinner tray. Later that morning, how much later he was never sure, he heard a different sound. High. Fast. Coming from above. American dive bombers, SBD Dauntlesses, screaming down from altitude. Gay was still in the water when the Japanese carriers began to burn. He could feel the heat on his face from across the waves. A PBY Catalina patrol plane found him the next day, 30 hours after he'd gone down. He was sunburned, dehydrated, bleeding from 3 wounds, and alive. Of the 30 men who launched from the Hornet that morning, 29 were gone. Not missing, not captured, gone. The Pacific Ocean does not return what it takes. No bodies were recovered. No wreckage was found. Waldron is memorialized on the Courts of the Missing at the Honolulu Memorial, a wall of names for men who have no graves. One day before all of that, June 3rd, 1942, a man had climbed aboard the USS Hornet carrying a 16mm movie camera. He didn't look like Navy. He didn't walk like Navy. He moved through the ship the way a man moves through a room when he's deciding how to light it. His name was John Ford. In 1940, Ford had won the Academy Award for Best Director for The Grapes of Wrath, the story of an Oklahoma family destroyed by the Depression, driven west, holding on to each other when everything else was gone. Henry Fonda played Tom Joad. Jane Darwell played Ma Joad, the face of every mother in America who had kept her family fed when the banks failed and the dust rolled in. In 1941, Ford won again. How Green Was My Valley. Back to back. 2 Oscars. 2 films about families torn apart by forces bigger than themselves. And now Ford was standing on the flight deck of a carrier in the middle of the Pacific with a camera crew of 2 and a commission in the Navy that he had essentially talked his way into. He spent that afternoon with Torpedo Squadron 8. He walked among them. He pointed his camera at them one by one. He filmed them the way he filmed actors on a set, with patience, with an eye for faces, letting the camera run long enough to catch the moments between the poses. Pilots leaning against the cowling of their devastators, crouching beside torpedoes and pretending to pat them for luck, squinting into the sun, laughing at something off camera that nobody today will ever know. Ford talked to them. He shook hands. He learned names. He looked at faces he would see again, on a different screen, in a different room, under different circumstances entirely. The next morning, 29 of those faces were gone. Ford himself was on Midway when the Japanese struck the island. He was filming from a power station when a bomb blast knocked him off his feet and drove shrapnel into his left arm. Purple Heart. He kept filming. But the wound he carried home was not the shrapnel. When the casualty reports came through, when Ford learned that 29 of the 30 men he had met and talked to and pointed his camera at were now dead, he said something that people remembered. "I am really a coward," he said, "compared to those men." And then he did the only thing he knew how to do. He went back to the footage. He took every frame of VT-8 he had, every face, every man on that deck who would never be seen alive again, and he cut it together into a film. Simple. Quiet. No battle footage. No narration about strategy or turning points. Just the men. Each pilot appeared on screen, and beneath his image, Ford placed a title card. 2 words. In memoriam. He brought in Henry Fonda to narrate. The same voice that had spoken for Tom Joad. The voice that half the country associated with decency and quiet endurance, and the kind of courage that doesn't make speeches. He brought in Jane Darwell, Ma Joad, the mother, the woman who kept her family together when the world fell apart. Ford gave her the lines about the families. He knew what those voices meant to the people who would hear them. He knew what it would feel like to sit in a living room in 1942 and hear Henry Fonda speak the name of your dead son. I think Ford understood something that most people in his business never did. He knew that some footage doesn't belong to the audience. It belongs to the people in it. And when those people are gone, it belongs to the ones who loved them. He printed the film to 8 millimeters, the small format, the one that worked in the home projectors families already owned. Not 35 millimeters for theaters, not 16 millimeters for military briefings. 8 millimeter, living room size. He made 30 copies, one for each family. He did not screen it in theaters. He did not release it to newsreels. He did not submit it for an Oscar. He did not put his name on the poster. He sent the packages, one to each address, and then he stopped. Across the country, projectors clicked to life after dinner, or after the children were in bed, or on a Sunday afternoon when the house was quiet enough to bear it. Screens, some a proper pull-down, some just a white bedsheet pinned to the wall, lit up with Kodachrome color in an era when most Americans had never seen color film outside a movie theater. 8 millimeter was a home format. It was the format of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and first steps on a lawn. It was the format of ordinary life. Ford chose it deliberately. He did not want these families to feel like they were watching a military film. He wanted them to feel like their son had just walked into the living room. And on that screen, their boy, alive, in the sun, on a ship, smiling at something that will never be heard. The last moving image that would ever exist of him. The film was not shown publicly for nearly 50 years. The copy that eventually reached the National Archives, the one you can find today on YouTube, on the Internet Archive, free to watch, came from one family, Adelaide and Nancy Waldron. The wife and the daughter of the man who stood up in his burning cockpit and waved his arms one last time before the Pacific took him. They kept the film for decades. They watched it in their own living room, on their own projector, year after year. Then they let the rest of us see it. George Gay came home. At Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital, Admiral Chester Nimitz walked in and shook his hand. The commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, standing beside the bed of a 25-year-old ensign from Texas who had been in the water for 30 hours with wounds in 3 places. By August, Gay's face was on the cover of Life magazine. Sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. The phrase became his title, his identity, the things strangers said when they recognized him on the street. It followed him for 52 years. But it was not entirely accurate. Torpedo 8 had 2 detachments at Midway. The 15 Devastators launched from the Hornet, but 6 TBF Avengers, the new planes VT-8 had been waiting for, the ones that arrived at Pearl Harbor one day too late, flew from Midway Island itself under a different flight leader, Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling. 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down. But one pilot, Ensign Albert Bert Ernest, brought his plane home. Home is a generous word. The TBF had nearly 100 holes in it. The hydraulics were gone. The elevator controls were shredded. One propeller blade looked like someone had taken a hammer to it. Grumman engineers later examined the wreckage with something close to reverence. They couldn't understand how it had stayed in the air. Ernest had earned 3 Navy Crosses by the end of the war. Nimitz himself called his flight back to Midway in that shattered Avenger an epic in combat aviation. His radio man, Harry Ferrier, had been wounded in the attack, but survived. Their plane was shipped back to Pearl Harbor, where Grumman's own engineers walked around it, counting holes, shaking their heads. They couldn't explain how the engine had kept running. They couldn't explain how the propeller, all 3 blades chewed up by shrapnel, had kept turning. But nobody put Ernest on the cover of Life. Nobody called him or Ferrier the sole survivors. They were the other men from Torpedo 8, the ones the story didn't need, because the story already had its hero. 40 years later, in 1982, the Navy held a ceremony for the anniversary of Midway. Gay was the guest of honor. He stood at the front of the room and spoke the way he always spoke, with the practiced ease of a man who had told the same story 100 times and knew which lines got the room quiet. Bert Ernest was in the room too, standing to the side. Somebody noticed him and asked who he was. Ernest glanced over at Ferrier and said, quietly, "Oh, we're the other lone survivors of Torpedo 8. Gay carried the weight for 52 years. Every June, the phone rang. Every anniversary, a reporter asked him to tell it again. And he did. Every time. He became the voice of Torpedo 8, not because he wanted to be, but because there was no one else. 29 men at the bottom of the Pacific cannot tell their own story. Bert Ernest could have told his, and did when anyone asked. But nobody asked. The nation needed one survivor, one face, one name, and it chose Gay. He went on to fly more combat missions. He served through the rest of the war. He earned the Navy Cross and the Purple Heart. He left the Navy and became a civilian pilot, flying for TWA, then running a charter service out of Georgia. He got married. He tried to live a normal life in a country that wouldn't let him forget the one morning that defined him. Every June, someone knocked on his door. Historians noticed that his accounts shifted over the decades. Details rearranged themselves. Sequences moved. The things he said he saw from the water changed depending on when he was asked. The version he gave in 1942, the one he wrote down closest to the event, was different from the version he gave in 1982. That is not dishonesty. That is what memory does when you carry it for half a century. It doesn't lie. It reshapes, It smooths some edges and sharpens others. It fills in the gaps with things that feel true. And after long enough, you can't tell the difference between what you saw and what you've spent a lifetime believing you saw. The one thing that never changed was the weight. 29 men flew with him that morning. He was the only one who landed anywhere but the bottom of the Pacific. On October 21st, 1994, George Gay died. He was 77 years old. His family carried out one final request. They took his ashes to a stretch of open ocean northwest of Midway Island, the same patch of water where 15 devastators went in on the morning of June 4th, 1942. They scattered him there. He had spent 52 years on the surface, walking around with the names of 29 men who never got to walk anywhere again. Then he went back to where they were. If you look for the film, Torpedo Squadron 8, that's the title, not the battle. You will find it. It's on the Internet Archive. It's free. It runs about 8 minutes. You will see faces, young faces. Some of them barely old enough to vote. They are standing in the Pacific sun on the deck of a carrier that will itself be at the bottom of the ocean 4 months later. They don't know that either. John Waldron is in the footage, the son of South Dakota, the son of a Lakota mother and a New Hampshire rancher. The man who typed out a memo, handed 30 copies to 30 men, and told them that if only one plane was left, he wanted that man to go in and get a hit. He climbed into a Devastator the next morning and turned his squadron away from the man giving the wrong orders. He flew toward 4 Japanese fleet carriers that the rest of the Hornets air group would never find. He found them because he understood the sea and the enemy and his own instinct better than anyone holding a compass that morning. He attacked them without fighter cover, without dive bomber support, without anything except 15 obsolete planes and the men who flew them. He stood in his burning cockpit and his arms moved one last time. Gay saw it. He was the only one who did. And then the water took him. His daughter Nancy grew up with that 8-minute film. She watched her father on a wall in her living room, alive and smiling, for decades. Years later, the Navy built a destroyer. They asked Nancy to christen it. She named it Waldron, USS Waldron, hull number D699, christened with the name of a man who has no grave, by the daughter who had nothing left of him but a reel of film shot by a 2-time Oscar winner on the deck of a ship that no longer exists. That is what remains. Not the turning point, not the 4 carriers, not the strategy that reversed the Pacific War, though all of that happened because of what these 30 men did. What remains is the film. 8 minutes of faces. 30 men who looked into a camera lens one afternoon in June, 1942, and did not know it was the last time anyone would ever see them move. If someone in your family served in the Second World War, and you still carry a story they told at the dinner table, something they mentioned once, and never brought up again, a detail so small you almost forgot it, write it down. Put it in the comments below. It doesn't have to be a battle. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be a name they said, a place they couldn't forget, a sound that followed them home. That generation is leaving us. Every month, more of them go. The men who flew at Midway are gone now. The men who built the ships are gone. The women who waited by the mailbox are almost gone. And when they go, those stories, the ones that never made it into the history books, the ones that only ever lived in one person's voice, at one kitchen table, in one family, go with them. Ford understood that. He made 30 copies of a film and sent them to 30 families because he knew that memory lives in the people who hold it. Not in archives, not in museums, in living rooms, in the quiet after dinner, in the flicker of a projector on a wall. Unless someone writes them down,